Hi everybody. I'm Catherine Stevens, AEI's Early Education Research Fellow, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for this event with Jack Shonkoff. When I introduce myself to policy wonks, they often say, "Oh, so what do you think about universal pre-K?" And in fact, it seems to me that much of the early childhood policy debate has gotten somewhat stuck on expanding pre-K for 4-year-olds. But a lot happens outside of pre-K and before a child turns 4 that will also significantly affect his or her life prospects. So I'm really excited about today's conversation because I think the science of early brain development that Jack's going to be talking to us about can help us move beyond these kinds of narrow debates over pre-K and focus on approaches that are most likely to help us craft good policy for supporting the development of young children. Before I introduce Dr. Shonkoff, I want to thank my colleague, Robert Dorr, for co-sponsoring this event with me. For those of you who don't know him, Robert leads the new Poverty Studies program here at AEI that's seeking to identify and develop better policies to improve the work and welfare of low-income Americans. Robert's been very supportive of my work in early childhood, and it's been a real pleasure to collaborate with him. I also want to mention that this event is being live streamed, and you can follow along on Twitter with the hashtag ShonkoffAtAEI. A video of the event will also be up on AEI's site by tomorrow. So as many of you here know, Jack Shonkoff is one of the leading pioneers in the science of early development. He's a professor of Child Health and Development at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and the director of the university-wide Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. Under the auspices of the National Academy of Sciences, he served as chair of the Board on Children, Youth, and Families and chaired a blue ribbon committee that produced the landmark report From Neurons to Neighborhoods, The Science of Early Childhood Development, that was published in 2000. Jack's received multiple honors, including elected membership to the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, the C. Anderson Aldrich Award in Child Development from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Award for Distinguished Contributions to Public Policy for Children from the Science for Research in Child Development. In 2011, Jack launched Frontiers of Innovation, a cross-disciplinary collaboration of researchers, practitioners, policymakers, investors, and systems change experts who are committed to driving science-based innovation that achieves breakthrough impacts on the development and health of young children facing adversity. So, as you can tell, Jack is very busy. We're really lucky to have him here at AEI and very much appreciate that he's taken the time to come today to speak with us. Jack, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Catherine and Robert, for this opportunity. It's really actually a treat for me to be here, and appreciate all of you here in person. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to move very quickly from kind of teeing up and framing the issue, because a lot of these issues have been around for a long time, and move quickly to thinking about where we might go in the future and thinking about this revolution in neuroscience as a kind of way to do that. So for starters, and I'm going to really spend, why do I have this magic ability to foul things up? It's really not working. Is it facing the wrong way? I'm pushing buttons. If it works when you push it, I'm going to be really disappointed. Oh, good. It's not me. So I'll just start while somebody figures that out. But it would help if somebody fixed it. Uh, so basically, we started with this framework that early childhood development and early brain development is really a foundation for pretty much most of the things that we care about as a society, right? So they're the pillars of where we want to get include kind of educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, good health. All of these things are pillars of, depending upon where you sit, I mean, everybody agrees that some combination of healthy communities, strong families, and a prosperous society is kind of that pretty much is a big tent that brings everybody in. But the challenge is kind of how do we do that? And so here's the problem, and I'm going to spend no time on this slide because there are people in the audience who are more experts than I am. But the problem is that the academic achievement gap in reading and math, particularly in reading, has kind of come down a fair amount based by race, even though we still have a ways to go. But the reading gap achievement by family income is increasing. It's increasing pretty high. And the important point for this presentation is that most of this gap is present at the first day of kindergarten when children arrive in school. And very little of that gap is reduced during the 12 years of elementary education on a population level. So now we move from what the problem is to the evidence base. I'm going to spend no more than 30 seconds on a slide that could consume weeks and weeks of fierce debate about the meaning of the program evaluation literature that we've built over half a century. We're really pretty close to 50 years now. And there are a couple of messages that come through here. One is we have demonstrated, these are 84 of the best studies out of a database of probably 10,000 published papers in 50 years that meet some reasonable criteria for a randomized trial or a quasi-experimental design. And we have shown over and over again that we have the capacity to move the needle. We have the capacity to produce better outcomes in a group that receives some kind of an intervention compared to a group that doesn't. So the question of whether we can change trajectories has really been answered over and over again. But the question about kind of how much can we do it and what are the active ingredients and what's the best way to do it continues to consume a huge amount of oxygen that we could put to better use. Whether it's academics arguing about methodological differences in a study or policymakers or advocates who are kind of taking either a glass half full or a glass half empty approach. And what I'd like to say, and this is the end of my kind of summary of where we are right now before I talk about where we could go next, is that interestingly enough, 15 years ago in Neurons to Neighborhoods, in the last page of the last chapter, we said that people who say that there's really nothing we can do early in life that's worth the investment have to confront the fact that the evidence is overwhelming that what happens early on really affects outcomes. And people who say that all we need is more money, we know exactly what to do, also really have to acknowledge that we don't know exactly what to do all the time in terms of getting bigger outcomes, not in terms of getting a boost, but in terms of really making huge dents in this gap. So the important point about this is with 50 years of program evaluation, the context in which families have been raising young children has changed dramatically, and a lot of the old data are data from an era that doesn't exist anymore. The context for families today is changes in family structure, a much higher percentage of low-income families with a single parent. The nature of work for low-income families and the relationship between work and family is dramatically different. When a lot of the iconic demonstration projects were done, one income by a person with a high school diploma could support a family, and now most families, most parents, most adults with limited education cannot get a job that will support one family. There's a lot of temporary work, there's a lot of part-time work, there's a lot of work with very unpredictable schedules. The access to reasonable quality childcare for people is very variable, particularly people who are just above the level of any kind of public subsidy. So this is a huge challenge to raise children in this environment. And what I'm going to do is spend the rest of the session answering the question of, so what does neuroscience have to do with that? But the one thing to say before we move beyond this is that in addition to the changes in family circumstances for raising young children, the goalposts have been moved. When most of the classic studies were done, The goal was to get a high school education. And even today, we talk about and we measure program impacts, although we don't have many longitudinal studies anymore, is how do we increase third grade reading scores, because they will predict the greater likelihood that you will graduate from high school. But the goalposts have been moved. A high school graduation does not really get you a job in this country that will support a family. So we've moved the goalposts, we've made it more difficult. We haven't made it, but it is more difficult for families. And so now the question is, where are we going to go from here? And here's my vision. And it comes from my training as a pediatrician. Bear with me for 30 seconds, because although I am not going to compare childhood leukemia to poverty, it's not my intention, but there's a very important message here. In 1965, 50 years ago, this summer, when Head Start was begun, the mortality rate for acute lymphocytic leukemia, which is the most common form of cancer in children, was 98%. If you had a diagnosis of that form of leukemia, it was a death sentence. 10 years later, the mortality rate, the survival rate was over 50%. And if we'll just kind of bring it up a couple more decades. So today, in 50 years, we've gone from 98% mortality to essentially a completely curable disease. And now the real issue is not will you survive, but what can we determine at the time of diagnosis about which treatment will work best for you. And then there are still people who are thinking about, even though the survival is high, how do we make the treatment less toxic? How do we make the experience more positive? How do we promote development? So what does this have to do with early childhood intervention and poverty? Two things explain this story. One is most of the people in the field of treatment of childhood leukemia at any given point in time were focusing on identifying children with the problem and making sure that at any point in time we provide state-of-the-art treatment. While a small segment of the field was working in the back room in the laboratory, desperately trying to figure out how to improve the effectiveness of the treatments, how to keep aiming higher and higher. When it got to 50% survival from 100% mortality, nobody declared victory and said mission accomplished. People said more, 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 more. And the trick was not guessing or pure advocacy from any part of the political spectrum. It was digging deeper into the underlying science, understanding the nature of the problem, its causes, how it does its damage, and what could we do knowing its underlying mechanisms to come up with better treatments. And that's a lesson that I want to now take forward in the rest of this presentation to talk about this revolution in biology that we are all living through right now. I'm talking about neuroscience, molecular biology, genomics, epigenetics. It is staggering, the things that we know now relative to what we knew 15 years ago when Neurons to Neighborhoods came out. You know, this was our synthesis of the knowledge base undergirding early childhood development. Most of what we knew from developmental behavioral research, we've added more nuanced insights, but those basic concepts that we have today are the same as what we had 15 years ago. The neuroscience was primitive relative to what it is right now, and we've barely seen the acceleration. So I'm going to show the first now of two very brief videos. It used to take about an hour to explain the neuroscience. Thanks to Al Race and his team at our center, we've distilled this into a 1-minute, 30-second video. This is your crash course in basic principles of normal neuroscience about how experience shapes the developing brain.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So this video is up on our website. It'll be on the AEI website tomorrow. You can look at it again if you'd like it. Basically, this has all of the essential principles of neurobiology that you need to know to understand how to bring it into the early childhood arena. And this video, which goes pretty quickly, took at least a year to produce. And the reason for that is that we had a group of very hard-nosed, unforgiving neuroscientists decide when it was ready to go out. This is not an advocacy piece. At one point, we were almost to the end, and someone said, wait, that one neuron there is upside down. You need to fix that. So the point is, you can take this and show it to the Society for Neuroscience, where 99.9% of the people in the audience don't really care about policy issues, and they'll all say this is accurate. So this is kind of the hard science. And the essential issue here is that the brain is shaped by experience. It's kind of built by experience, this interaction between genetics and the environment. And when we talk about experience, we talk about the impact of environment on brain circuitry. The scientists kind of always say, well, what do you mean by the environment? I mean, how do you measure that? And what we know from this, and it's not just from extensive human studies, but a lot of the neuroscience that we have right now comes from studies of animals. Because the basic principles of biology are the same everywhere. It's not just for humans. And in fact, several years ago, I did a presentation in South Carolina, and there was someone in the audience, this was the beginning of a wonderful relationship, who basically was a fierce advocate for intelligent design, who loved this because for him it was proof of intelligent design, because only God would think of something this brilliant, of experience shaping the brain. And it's interesting because this comes from evolutionary biology. So I think one important message here is that science really can provide a common table for us to come together. We have a lot of differences about what to do with the science and what kind of policies we should have. But the science, if we want to bring science to the table, is really kind of nonpartisan. And actually, this principle even makes sense to people who believe in intelligent design. So the academics, who include a bunch of my friends, talk about the active ingredient of the environment as a contingent reciprocity, the extent to which what babies do and what adults do kind of are related and responsive back and forth. We call this serve and return interaction, so you can talk to legislative bodies and regular people, and they know what it means. What it says is that it's this serve and return responsive contingent interaction that literally shapes the brain circuits for early learning and what are the foundations of literacy. So it looks like this. These are the kinds of things that work for healthy development and that are a real problem for the brain when you don't have it. So beginning in the earliest days of infancy, it is wired into our biology that when a baby is in front of you, you kind of coo-coo and gaga, not because you read a manual about it, but you can't help yourself. It's kind of built in, which is good because humans are helpless for the longest period of time after birth. Most other animals, it could be days, weeks, or at most months, and they're off on their own. And humans are years, and some people would say forever. They never leave home, or they leave and they come back. They leave the nest, but they come back. And so because we're so dependent, the value of that is it takes us longer to get to the point of being independent, but independent humans can do things that independent animals can't do. But it takes time. So the absence of this responsiveness and interaction is life-threatening. So it's not dependent necessarily on being taught to do this. If you're severely impaired, you may have problems with that, but it's not something you need to be taught. So this kind of smiling, cooing, face-to-face interaction is not just kind of nice to look at. This is literally building brain circuits. The brain is expecting it, and the interaction and responsiveness is strengthening those circuits. Every interaction with children as they get a little bit older, kind of like the toddler years. This, by the way, is the story of early literacy that I'm showing you here. So, aside from the usual supermarket experiences where you're just hoping your child will stop screaming so you're not embarrassed in front of all the other people waiting in line to check out, every interaction in every mundane setting is an opportunity to engage in conversation, an opportunity to give names to things, to explain things, instead of just keep quiet, shove the food in the basket. Oh, I don't know what this is. I can't see it, a tomato, a pepper, or whatever. So that's what we mean by a language-rich environment. That's what we mean by talking about things. This is building brain circuits. This is going back to that video. It's strengthening circuits for language development. It's pruning away, the brain is pruning away the circuits that understand the difference in sounds from a language it's never heard, beginning to specialize in the language of the environment. The brain at birth can speak every language in the world. If you live in a bilingual setting from the very beginning, you'll speak fluently in 2 languages. If you're exposed to 3 languages, the brain will learn 3, but it'll prune away the circuits to speak fluently in languages it never hears, which is why after a certain age, no matter how smart you are, you can't learn another language without speaking with an accent. And any regular old baby can speak 2 languages fluently without flashcards or an instruction. We read to children before the brain has the circuitry to be able to learn reading on its own, making reading a pleasurable social interaction activity, having children begin to get a sense that there's a language on paper with straight lines and curves and pictures. This is all priming the brain for learning not only that language can be verbal, but there's a written language. So in the beginning, kids will not learn to read from kind of automatic flashcards or some video production. This is kind of an interactive experience. And at some point, as the brain matures and more complex circuits built on simple circuits, children don't need adults to read to them anymore. They can read by themselves or they can read with each other. But then the brain hasn't yet developed a circuitry to write. It needs an adult. It needs an interaction to teach you how to write. And then after that, you're off on your own. You can write book reports and sonnets and blogs, and you can write policy briefs and poetry. But it happens in a sequence. And at any point in time, you're building on what happened before. Remember that video. The circuits start basic and they build more complex. So that's the end of the story of normal brain development, with normal being very widely dispersed in terms of a lot of variation around the norm. There's huge variability in a healthy normal population. It's all about the interaction between experience and genetics. And now I want to talk to what happens under circumstances of significant adversity. So these data are taken from a national study of about 1,100 kids, all of whom were aged 3 years, and in active cases in a child welfare system in different state systems across the country. So every one of these 1,100 kids was kind of an active Child Protective Service case. And the question in the study was, in addition to documented abuse or neglect, what's the relationship with the number of additional risk factors in the child's life and performance on a developmental test at age 3, which is a very strong predictor of the need for special help in school or being on your way to do well in a regular academic program. And the findings here represent a pattern that you see in absolutely every study that's ever been done that's asked the question of what's the relationship between the pile-up of risk factors and whatever outcome you want to pick. Vocabulary, reading, math, school performance, health outcomes, physical health, mental health, and this is what it looks like. 1 or 2 risk factors doesn't do you in, but as the number of risk factors increases, the poorer outcomes become more likely, and these data show that by the time you get to 6 or 7 risk factors, basically 90 to 100% of the 3-year-olds experiencing this level of adversity are all failing a developmental test at age 3. This is not just problems in emotional and social development. This is significant delays in language development and cognitive skills and all of the things that are measured at that age. So the message here is that increasing amounts of adversity are affecting the development of the brain, right? A developmental test is to the brain as a urine analysis is to the kidney. Play my pediatric card. It's telling you how the brain is working. way before we had all of this dramatic neuroimaging that has really gotten everybody excited. You know, and you put up an fMRI or a brain scan and you say, you see, look what happens with adversity, and everybody says, oh my goodness, this is real. But we've known for a long time that the developmental behavioral consequences are also telling us that there's something different about the way the brain is working. This is not a measure of how the pancreas is functioning. It's about the brain. So here's the second video, which is our 1 minute and 30-second summary of the impact of what we call toxic stress, which is kind of chronic activation of the stress response system in the presence of these kind of multitude of sources of adversity that continue over time.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Once again, this took a long time to finish because it went through very serious scientific review. The message here is that stress by itself is inherently not bad. It's a part of normal life. Children need to experience stress. They need to learn how to develop the ability to cope with stress and adapt to stress. Sometimes there are very serious stressors, worse than, you can't have 3 cookies right now, but the stress of a natural disaster or an act of terrorism or death in the family. And the difference between who has consequences, long-term consequences for that, and who doesn't, is whether there are adults who help a child get through that stressful experience, help to bring the stress system down before it starts to do this kind of wear and tear effect on the brain and other organ systems. So just so you're not left just with animations and cartoons, this is a section of brain tissue taken from a real animal. Okay, this is actually, I think it's from mice. But it's a recreation and a reproduction from a cross section. What you're seeing are 3 dendrites on one single nerve cell with all of these multiple axons coming in. These are all of these different connections that are made in the brain. If you look at this, we have billions and billions of cells and trillions of synapses in our brains, and every one of them is affected and shaped by the impact of experience coming in to affect a lot of these. So this is real, and you can imagine the complexity, and you can get some sense of the degree to which neuroscience at its frontiers is actually down to looking at the level of what these fibers look like and being able to kind of see the impact of different kinds of genetic predispositions and the impact of experience. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a sprint in the final part of my presentation to show you how we are using these insights and principles of neuroscience and molecular biology to think about how might we approach early childhood policy and practice in a way that will take us into 21st century policy and practice along with 21st century science. Okay? So for starters, here's the challenge. This is the ugly truth. This is the concept of neuroplasticity, which refers to the flexibility or adaptability of the brain to basically adapt, to change, and build new skills. And this is what the plasticity curve looks like. I'm sorry. It's like our brain is optimally plastic at birth and in early childhood, and it has a pretty precipitous drop that it kind of levels off. Everybody looks at this and finds your own age on that map. The important message here is not that you can't change things later. The message is that the older you get, the higher the physiological cost to the brain to try to adapt to some new challenge based on what happened before. If you look at the dropping plasticity curve, this goes up to age 70. It's kind of all the room there is on the slide. If it went up to 110, if there was somebody sitting here who was 105 years old and learned one new thing this afternoon and remembered it tomorrow, a new circuit was made in the brain. The brain, it's only when you're a flat line and they pull the sheet up that you no longer have the capacity to learn something new, but it is harder. It costs more in energy for the brain, it costs more to society in remediation, and the outcome is never as good as it would have been if you had gotten it right the first time, but it's never too late to do anything. So you see how precious the early childhood period is. And if you go back to the first animation, it's because in the beginning, we don't have that many circuits. And so there's lots of adaptability. You haven't started to prune out the use it or lose it. You start to prune out things you don't use, or you disrupt things that are being disrupted, then you're stuck with working with that for the rest of your life. But nobody should leave this room with a take-home message that this is a kind of doomsday scenario of ultra-determinism. The possibilities of improvement are always there because the brain is always trying to get back on track. But it means that we, at our peril, ignore the early period when it's a lot easier to get it right the first time. So what should we do about that? So there's this funny thing about biology. Biology does not want to get things wrong. Biology is designed to keep on track, and if you're pushed off track, to get back on track. This is the essential adaptiveness of biology. So it's almost as if Mother Nature was saying to us, you better pay attention to the early childhood years, but if you don't, I'm going to give you one more chance. So this is the kind of two windows for intervention. This slide, when I click it on, shows you the development of what are called executive function and self-regulation skills, the ability to kind of set goals and make a plan and solve problems and focus your attention and control impulses and delay gratification, all the things that you need to be an effective parent, to be a productive worker, to be a successful student, all these higher level skills. And this is what the curve for the development of these skills are. This is the part of the brain that takes the longest to mature. This is the prefrontal cortex. The period of most rapid development is age 3 to 5, but it starts in early infancy, the development of these skills. This is where your grandmother could have told you this, and when your grandmother could tell you what neuroscience has to say, you know it's right, this is the difference between a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. Is a 5-year-old can sit still longer, pay attention more, follow directions, figure things out. That's what these skills are all about. But so here's the issue. These skills, this part of the brain continues to develop. It doesn't really level off until age 25 to 30 years. And there's another period of accelerated plasticity from 15 to 25 years of age. And that's that window, that's that adolescent period everybody hears about in different forms. This is a window, and what an interesting coincidence. This is the age range for a lot of low-income parents. Age 15 to 25 and pushing 25 to 30, where the brain is more plastic to build these skills. And we know they don't come in on automatic pilot. They are shaped by interaction. They're shaped by coaching, by mentoring, by scaffolding, and by practice. Interesting thinking about what could we be doing other than giving people advice and information. Maybe we could be building the kind of skills that are critical to then scaffold the development of these skills in young children. So we have been taking this science and our strategy, and now I'm going to end by telling you how we're thinking about this, not with the answers, but tell you how we are creating a community of people who share our desire to take this field to another place. And for us, 21st century science is not just about making the case for paying attention to early childhood. We've been doing that for a while, and we have to keep doing that. It's real. but it also is sitting there waiting to be used to develop new theories of change of what we might do on top of the best of what we're doing right now. Like the leukemia example, okay? Not settle for the fact that we can move the needle, but figure how do we move the needle even more and go to the basic science for insights rather than just kind of go to the barricades and fight about whether we should spend more or less money for different programs. So for us, the issue here is that children's capabilities and skills are basically developed by the scaffolding of the capabilities of the adults who care for them. That starts in the family, obviously, with the parents, but it includes a lot of other adults who spend a lot of time with them, like people who work in early care and education programs and teachers in preschool programs, who are important part of the environment of relationships. But every study also shows that the family variables are always the ones that account for the biggest amount of the variance. So for us, our leading theory of change at this point is because we want big outcomes. We don't just want another 2% of on a vocabulary test. Our theory of change is that if we really want to produce breakthrough outcomes for children, we have to figure out how to transform the lives of the adults who are taking care of them. And by the way, that means not just building parenting skills, but that means building the kind of skills that will help people to become more economically self-sufficient and to be able to be better functioning members of a community. And that means there's a lot of money being spent in a lot of different funding streams and policy arenas, all of which have at their core these basic adult capabilities that are necessary for being a successful adult. And we can start to think about these skills and think about what we know about how you build them, and that gets us to say we've got to do something more than just give parents advice and information and tell them to read to their kids, even though that is absolutely important. So the last thing I want to say is the issue of scaling, because we have agonized about this. We have demonstration projects that have shown us what's possible. The demonstration projects have had the biggest impacts. And when we take things to scale, there's always the challenge of how the impacts are not as big. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that that have to do with the quality of the implementation, all those things. But here's the last thing I want to leave you with that has to be part of where the field goes next. From the day that the first early childhood program was set up, everyone has talked about the fact that this is not a one-size-fits-all model, right? There's no one thing, there's no one magic bullet that's going to solve things for everybody. But for 50 years, we've built an evaluation database that people argue about all the time that was designed and is debated in terms of how it answers the question of, is a program effective or not? Or what is the most effective program? That's the wrong question. 21st century science is telling us exactly why it's the wrong question. It's a set of questions that we should be asking, is not whether it works or not, but for whom does it have a big impact, if anybody, and for whom does it have very little or no impact? And how do we understand that and why? That's using the science to get at the underlying mechanisms of how experience is affecting gene expression and affecting skills. And what we need is a portfolio of interventions that are matched to different kinds of kids and different kinds of families based on what their resources are, what their capabilities are at the baseline, and where their needs are. And the segmentation, the subgroup analysis, is not about race or ethnicity or mother's education, because there's too much variability within those groups. So this is the problem. We have to be more explicit about step 2 in everything we do. What is the intervention? What is it focused on? What are the outcomes we're looking at, and for whom does it work and why? And if we replicate that and get a big effect again, we're ready to scale for that part of the population, while we go back to the drawing board for those for whom it didn't work and say, why didn't it work? What should we do differently? That's the leukemia story. So this is the game plan, and this is what's driving our work. The early childhood field needs an R&D platform, and the landscape needs to change to not argue about whether we invest or not, but to figure out how we can drive innovation and get bigger outcomes. And there are 3 dimensions to this. One is to think about the science that I've presented a little snippet of this afternoon for you as a different way of thinking about an expanded definition of evidence. If we define evidence only as the result of program evaluation studies and say we will only invest in programs that have been proved to work, you tell me how we're going to develop anything new. And the neuroscience that I shared with you is very powerful evidence about how development and learning takes place. That has to be part of our thinking. The second is innovation. Our country is still the leader in the world for innovation driving breakthroughs in a variety of fields. And innovation, for those people who live and breathe innovation, is taking risks. It's failing over and over again until you get it right. It's rapid cycle learning. It's iteration. It's not saying, give me the answer and then I'll pay for it. And it's not saying you can't fail. You've got to show me you're succeeding. We have to bring a true culture of innovation into a part of the field that makes it okay to take some risks and try things and learn from things that don't work, not hope the funder doesn't find out and wish that the scientific journals would publish a paper about something that didn't work rather than just things that work. And the last is distributed leadership. This is, we work at Harvard. There are a lot of smart people there. Most of the smart people in the country are not at Harvard. Not everybody there is smart. There are a lot of smart people all over the place. Oh God, I forgot this is being videoed and it's going to be up. Most of the field should be really striving for and modeling state of the art, but there has to be a part of the field that is chronically, lovingly, constructively dissatisfied with what we're achieving and is always saying it has to be better, it has to be better, it has to be better. It has to look at state of the art as the starting point and figure out how we're going to go next. And that means a certain kind of researcher, a certain kind of service provider, a certain kind of investor, a certain kind of policymaker. And the whole field shouldn't be filled with those people. It would be chaos. But the absence of that part of the field, which should be the big tent issue that everybody, regardless of political persuasion, desperately wants, which is greater impact, that's what we would love to see built. Here's our website. If any of you, we have a lot of material up there that translates a lot of the science for non-scientists. I apologize, I ran over, I'm really sorry. I think I will stop right here and really look forward to a lively conversation. So thanks very much.
So, Catherine, thank you very much for a great introduction. Dr. Shalkoff, thank you for a great presentation. Jack, it's a pleasure, really a great honor to have you here. I've followed you in time before when I was at HRA in New York City running poverty programs. So this is important research, important work, and you are a hero in the field, so thank you for being here. But I want to start out by asking you about the chart about the gaps in reading scores. And you showed the racial white-black reading gap has dropped. There's been some progress there. When it comes to income reading gap, it's getting worse, low income versus high income. If you were to do the same chart with regard to children of never married mothers and compare them to the children of married parents, what would this line look like? And is there a gap there?
Yeah. No, it's obviously a very important question. And part of the problem is that marital status and family income are so tightly correlated because a single parent family, with rare exceptions, has less income than a two-parent family. I think for me, the big, I don't know, let me start by saying, if you're ever in a room with somebody who never says, I don't know, don't believe anything that person says. Right? So I don't really know the precise answer to that question. But what I do know is that being a single parent is obviously much more difficult than sharing that responsibility with somebody else. The other thing I know is that we have pretty good data that over this same time period, both single and two-parent families who are low income with limited education, when it's been studied, many parents in that part of the population are actually talking to their kids more and are reading to their kids more. And a large part of that increasing gap is due to the fact that the well-educated part of the population is also learning about this stuff. And there are also many more involved fathers among the more educated and economically secure families who are spending more time with their young kids. And so it's the top that's kind of really pushing the gap rather than the bottom falling further down.
But just to press a little bit on that, given the emphasis in so much of what you said on the interaction between adults and the child at an early age, why wasn't there a greater emphasis on the role of fathers, the role of two committed parents in children's life right from the beginning?
Yeah. Honestly, and so it's an opinion now. I'm not speaking science, in my opinion. You know, I think we've politicized the issue of family structure so much, and we've also politicized the issue of the role that men play in the lives of their kids, that we've made it really hard to have an honest conversation about that. I also think, you know, it's interesting. So I'm a grandparent now, very young grandparent, but I'm a grandparent, and I have 3 grandchildren, and I look at what a wonderful home life they have, with 2 very dedicated parents, and really proud of my son and what a great father he is, both of whom are working. I watch their home and I see how well these kids are doing, and I'm even more staggered by, I don't know how a single person manages alone without. And in fact, the reality is that people who studied have said that a lot of the, quote, single parent families actually have 2 parents in the home. And they're equivalent of extended families. They're just not traditional kind of married, kind of on record that way. So I think we could actually be honest and say, I don't know how a single person is able to manage work and a child without support. And I think the answer is a lot of people do it in a lot of informal, including a lot of situations where there are a mother and a father in the home, but they're not married, and those people may shift. There may be a different father at a different point. But I think we could all agree that 2 people would be better than 1 raising a child. The issue is, what could we do to kind of both support those who are only a single parent, and what could we do? I think all of us would have a vested interest in how to increase the likelihood that more families would have the support of more adults to raise children. I think it's a false argument about saying it's fine to raise kids by yourself, but a lot of people do a magnificent job doing it. I don't know how they do it. And some of our favorite stories of the kids who overcome everything are the kids who come from a single parent family. But I think the most important thing to remember from this is, no matter what you look at, family structure, income, parent education, there's a gradient, but there's huge variability around every point in the curve. So on average, yes, it's a problem. But there are many single parents doing a magnificent job raising healthy kids. And there are kids growing up in 2-parent, well-educated families who are a mess. And so I think figuring out how to take that into account, but then think of how could we help support families. I know in many cases there are economic incentives for people to remain single parents, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think it has to do with government policy either. It has to do with who's helping to support the family. It's complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated, but as a counselor of a prospective parent,
Right.
a young person who has maybe limited educational achievement, not such a great work situation, talking about the effective raising of children,
Yep.
you would want to say to them, it'd be better to have a committed co-parent before you have a child.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's not a position you'd argue with, but I don't know any data that would say anything I said would make a difference, right, in terms of advice. So I would go back to the slide on executive function and self-regulation, because that may be a new way. For me, the issue is, can we have some new ways to think about this, right? So we've learned a lot now, and we know now that one of the parts of the brain most sensitive to toxic stress is that part of the prefrontal cortex involved with these executive function skills. So think about what they are. This is the ability to plan, the ability to control your impulses, the ability to delay gratification, the ability to kind of come up with a plan for how to make a life that you want, and deal with the bumps in the road and shift your plan. And all of these things are what make for a successful adult. And actually, if you start to put them in that other context, it sounds to me like a better way to have people figure out when in their life they want to have a baby and when they want to make a family. And these are the kinds of skills you need to make these decisions. And we have this window to break this intergenerational cycle of not developing these skills. I put more money into that than preaching about, you know, contraception or marital status to teenagers and young adults.
Preaching's pretty cheap, though.
I know it is, but it also
And when it comes from someone from Harvard,
and you get what you pay for, right? That's
Well,
the problem.
no, but it's not a lot of money.
Yeah.
just a messaging thing.
So
the thing is, on the interventions,
Mm-hmm.
it's so clear that the children need a much greater attention to their development in early years. It happens to be easier if you have two parents involved, but in the absence of them, you have to have other kinds of interventions, and that's
So-
what probably Catherine wants to ask you about.
I guess the last thing I'd say about that, Robert, is what's clear is that healthy development requires at least one secure, attached, responsive relationship. And if there's one that's doing that job, it's enough. I think the additional parents are as much making it possible for anybody to provide that kind of environment, because the research shows that it's easier, but not impossible as a single parent. But nobody would advocate for raising a child alone. The question is, how do you promote that? And I think part of it is also, how do you promote people's ability to be able to have more control over their lives and make choices about when they want to get pregnant and how they're going to become economically self-sufficient. It's an important issue for us to figure out.
I was given one. I took three. It wasn't fair. It's your turn.
Solve one part of it.
Yeah.
So, Jack, there are all kinds of wonderful little boutique programs here and there, right? That we can point to and get excited about. How is what you're talking about going to be really any different from that when we're looking back at all this 20 years from now?
Right. Well, I'll be really blunt and honest about it. I'm kind of worn out on boutique programs. I feel like, Perry Preschool, Abecedarian, they demonstrated some very important examples of what's possible, right? But I don't know, we can't squeeze any more blood out of Perry Preschool to kind of make the case for everything else we do. So I think the boutique programs, or the iconic demonstration programs, answered the proof of concept. Those were the efficacy questions. Is it possible? Is it possible to change trajectories? And that question's been answered enough to say, absolutely, it's possible. But now I think the only kind of boutique programs we need are programs that will give us a deeper understanding of what is working for whom and why, so that we can scale them, as opposed to another boutique program that we can't scale because it isn't precise enough about what's different about it, and it isn't answering the question of what works for whom. Because I would say, from everything I know about development, I would not believe for 1 minute that anybody would present data from a program and say, this is the answer. Scale this for everybody, because everything we know about development means that there are differences in vulnerability and resilience among kids, and it's not hardwired. Every kids are different. Every parent who has more than one kid knows that kids are different. But resilience, which is a lot of these capabilities, is shaped by experience, and we know the big enchilada for resilience are supportive relationships that buffer kids against toxic stress and help to build those capabilities that give kids the ability to deal with adversity themselves. And so the boutique programs, for me, would provide a very important function if they were asking very specific questions and trying new things that we could then use as how to increase our knowledge about what works for whom in a way that would then be scalable. I think we have to start thinking about how to scale. And most people now think about scaling in terms of which is the best program to scale. And I think we should change the framework. It's how do we develop a portfolio of interventions matched to different kinds of kids and families that together will allow us to scale and get population level impacts.
So in the post-welfare reform period, we had an experience where a lot of never married moms were pushed and pulled into the workforce dramatically with the offering of childcare. And there was a great deal of worry that this would have negative consequences for children. My reading of it is that isn't really what happened. Mm-hmm. And that one could maybe even say that by having the children move into a childcare setting that may have more positive developmental aspects, the children benefited. Where do you come down on that one?
It's a great question, because I don't want to sound like a Johnny One Note, but this is how our thinking has evolved, from coming to similar conclusions through different lenses. So my understanding of the aftermath of welfare reform is that there were many women who were on public assistance who then went to work, and their kids did well. The kids did fine. And those who went to work and improved their economic circumstances, the kids actually benefited from that improvement. There are also women who substituted self-supported poverty for publicly supported poverty, didn't eliminate the stresses of poverty. Their kids were no better, no worse, but they were still dealing with the consequences of poverty. And there were also women, and I think this experiment of nature, because the welfare reform initiation was at a time of high, employment opportunities. So there, across the board, everybody agrees. There was a segment of the welfare dependent population who, in a booming economy with lots of jobs, still could not get and hold a job. People with serious problems of depression, very serious limited education, inability to kind of work. And so to me, that is another example of how we need a different strategy for different subgroups of the target population. I don't think anybody would argue, well, that's a silly thing to say. People argue about anything. I would not argue with the fact that for children to see their parents working and being economically self-supporting is better for children than for families to be on public assistance.
Well,
but not if you're not getting out of poverty, and not if you can't hold a job. So.
I was actually, that was something that I'm interested in, but what I was more interested in was the child developmental effects of being in a different environment by virtue of being in childcare.
So this is another easy one.
Mm-hmm. Well, good.
I'll start with the brain development and go from there.
Yeah.
The brain is expecting and needs serve and return interaction. It needs to be in an environment of responsive relationships. The brain, if the brain gets it, the brain thrives and builds healthy circuits. If it doesn't get it, it's in trouble. There's no part of the brain that says, is this responsiveness being provided by a member of my biological family? Or is this being provided by somebody who's like a friendly neighbor or part of the extended family? Or is somebody actually being paid to do this at a decent wage or a low wage? The brain is just saying somebody's responding to my needs or somebody isn't. So every study we've ever done, and God knows the number of trees who've given their lives, that's not the problem anymore because most of it is just online. But in the old days, the number of trees who gave their lives for all of the studies about all these alternative forms of care, a couple of messages came out always loud and clear. It's the quality of the care, not whether it's in a center or whether it's a home. That there's huge variability in quality, and that there's a threshold above which good enough quality is good, and there's a threshold below which bad quality is actually bad and could be dangerous. Also, in every study, it's been shown, including the big NICHD childcare study, that although the quality of the childcare environment affects children's outcomes, it's always family variables that accounts for a bigger part of the outcomes. So, of course, the family is a major influence, but so are others. And again, it's back to neuroscience. No, don't expect a neuroscientist to make a recommendation about childcare policy, but they will tell you that any of a variety of people could be providing what's needed, but not too many, and not too many who are changing all the time. That's the big
factor.
That's the big problem in childcare in this country. The low wages and that whole problem is the turnover. Is not just an administrative problem for the people running programs. Every turnover in a childcare center is actually a traumatic loss. It's either a loss of a good relationship, which then a child has to deal with, or it's no big deal because it wasn't a good relationship to begin with. In either case, it's a problem. So the stability of the relationships and the extent to which they're individualized, which is not that complicated. You just have to see it supported.
But that applies as well to the stability of the relationships inside the household.
Right.
Absolutely. It applies to the childcare worker. It definitely applies
absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, the lowest hanging fruit on this, to me, I'm still baffled by today still that we're struggling with this, is the TANF system in terms of making a major priority about the quality of the care that's provided for kids when their parents go to work, and particularly for those who are the hardest to place and the hardest to hold good jobs, which means that they're more likely to have more limited education, more mental health problems. Depression is a huge problem. So these are the kids at highest risk, and we know who they are. Okay, we know where they live, we know their names, and the science is saying, science is, I'm not going to take a stand on whether mothers should be forced to work or not, but I will take a stand, says science, on the fact that whoever's going to care for those kids, this is a very high-risk group. That needs to be really high-quality childcare. That can't just be somebody who will make sure a kid doesn't fall out a window or down a well. And that should be, if there's one thing that's the lowest hanging fruit from what the neuroscience is saying, is that population where we're struggling about work requirements should, whether the kids are home with their mothers all the time or the mothers are working, that should be our highest priority for the highest quality childcare. Because that's where we will make a big difference. Because remember, those circuits are being shaped every day. And it's a shame to see the way we have just missed that whole point in the welfare reform discussion.
So, Jack, sort of along these lines, 50 years ago, people got the brilliant idea that families were enormously important, that the role of the family was absolutely crucial for child development, that there was this group of extremely high-risk kids, and we knew who they were. They started a 8-week pilot summer program
Right.
to see if it would work. That was called Head Start.
Yep.
Here we are 50 years later. How is what you're talking about different from just doing Head Start all over again?
Oh, God. So I want to try to stay on script here and talk about what science has to say about this. I don't think my political opinion should matter, right? It's a political mess, right? The way we kind of fight back and forth on this.
But
I
on
think-
the science part to start with. And then
So
we can-
for me, whether it's Head Start or Early Head Start or any other system like that, or what some people might call, kind of like a childcare, we say we don't really have a system. For me, it's like, where is the R&D component? Where is the part that is constantly asking and trying to answer the question of, what's it going to look like in 5 years? What's it going to look like in 10 years? And this is what I'm obsessed with right now, because for me, a measure of whether we can move this field to another place where everybody has a vested interest in kids doing better is, in 10 or 15 years, there have to be some things we're doing today that we will say, I can't believe they were doing that in 2015. What were they thinking? And how many things could we identify where we say, I can't believe they were doing that in 1990 or 1980? And that, I'm not going to put a blame on anybody because it's shared responsibility. You can't unilaterally disarm, right? So you can't experiment in an environment where it's not safe to take risks. You can't experiment in an environment where if it doesn't work, you may lose your funding, or people will say, this proves that none of this stuff works. No field, whether it's biomedical research, or the military, think about, oh God, get into this now, right? I mean, believe me, I know less about what to do about the problems of the world right now, but if the military were using World War II knowledge to figure out how to deal with military, we know that the military is constantly trying to figure out what the right strategy is in a very different environment. Biomedicine, if it didn't have the space, when those leukemia improvements were made, there were some treatments people tried that resulted in earlier death. There were some things that people tried that made kids sicker. And nobody said, that's it, no more research. They said, just what did you learn from that? That's the analogy that we need. So to pick on any part of the system, for me, this is an equal opportunity issue. I think we need to create an environment or part of the environment, and this is where the political forces become important to say, we're gonna have part of this system be given some space to try some things, and failure is no problem if you learn something from it.
But I thought you said that you're sort of tired of boutique little programs.
That's correct.
Isn't the environment you're describing where, let 1,000 flowers bloom and
No.
little people
My
try?
definition of a boutique program was somebody's trying something and not done or set up in a way that will allow us to answer important questions about what to do.
So experimentation and small programs that aren't yet scaled, that are properly evaluated, they're worth trying.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and in fact, so let's talk a little bit about both the tremendous power and the albatross around our neck of randomized controlled trials.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, and again, randomized controlled trials come from a medical model. Let's think about how drugs are developed, right? So first of all, RCTs are very expensive, and once you start one, you can't change anything, right? Otherwise, you won't learn anything. Well, there's no drug company that kind of comes up with a possible idea for a new treatment that starts with an RCT, right? I mean, there's a lot of research first about trying things to see whether it has an effect, and whether the effect is better than the best thing you have right now, or whether it has an effect but it also has serious toxic side effects. You know, you have to answer all those questions. Call that my variation of the boutique program, like micro trials with small numbers of kids with an idea of something that you think is
That aren't necessarily randomized controlled experiments.
you don't randomize until you can figure out what it is you're randomizing to test. And this requires, because in the beginning, a new idea, this is one of the, well, I'm not going to get into that.
There's no script here.
Yeah, no, I get it, I get it. I just don't want to get into a thing
something, yeah.
that'll create more trouble. But so let's say we have a new idea for an intervention that we think ought to make a big difference. Well, the first question is, I mean, can people do it, right? You need to do a feasibility test. You have a great idea, but you find out that the people who are working in a program can't do it, or it takes time for them to figure out how to do it. So first you have to figure out how to do it. Then you have to implement it and see if you get an impact. You wouldn't start doing that with 1,000 children and families. You start with a dozen, you start with 2 dozen. You find out what's working with, and then as you start to learn things in that boutique, right, then start replicating in a few more. And now you really know something. You know what the intervention is, you know how to deliver it, you know what it is you're trying, and now maybe you're ready for an RCT. So when we start a new program and we mandate an RCT because that's the only way we'll know if it works, that's the only way at the end of the line that you know that it's better than nothing, or better than an alternative, but it's not the way you develop new ideas.
So, last question from me. I thought I heard you say, and maybe I didn't hear it right, I'm tired of just more education and parenting education and sort of trying to guide families on how to intervene in their children's lives in a more successful way. And your preference, I think, is an actual program or a facility where a child can be exposed to the kinds of care that you are hoping for. Is that what you meant?
Let me refine.
Okay.
That kind of, so first of all, I'm not tired of anything that's making a difference at all. And I think there's a part of the population of low-income families who are actually, you know, they got a lot going for them, even though they're poor and even though they have a lot of education, and they're doing a great job raising their kids. And I think there's a part of that population for which some information and education and a modest amount of support can get a very big bang for the buck and produce good outcomes. I'm coming back to my segmentation story here, right? So yes, I don't want to stop that. In fact, I want to see that money going to those families for whom that's going to make a difference. But I am tired of saying that if we just provide information and support and guidance for people dealing with poverty and low income and substance abuse and depression and intimate partner violence, this is where, again, the science says, well, do you realize what's going on in the brain there? What are you smoking to say that just giving people information is going to break through that? Because I think if that were enough, we would be seeing a lot better impacts from the stuff we're doing. And also, I think well-educated people with lots of resources also know. I mean, I'll say, so when my kids were growing up, I mean, I knew all this, a lot of this stuff. I was a daddy at home. I wasn't like a developmental specialist. I often knew what kind of the right thing was to do, but not always, but that didn't mean knowing what the right thing was to do. You have a sleeping problem, you go get 3 books, right? They give you 3 different area of advice, each one totally different from the other. So some advice alone, even for people with a lot of information, doesn't mean you can use it or doesn't mean it solves your problem. And so I think what's beautiful about this is that this really brings together people who have a shared interest in we want to see our money used for good purposes and we want to maximize return on investment. So for women who are low income, first baby, don't know much about raising kids, I would like to see a modest amount of money spent for a home visitor who can provide the social support information to make a difference to that family. I do not want to see money spent for a warm-hearted person with limited training making home visits to women with serious depression and substance abuse problems and feel good that we're doing something for them. It's a waste of money. it's a shame to kind of provide so little for people who need more, and we all pay a huge price for that later, right? So it's about getting smarter, about using our ability to it's being more explicit about step 2. It's like it's not just doing something and something.
But it is also about segmentation.
It's about segmentation.
It's about identifying where the issues are most severe.
It's about, I think this is the thing that crosses the political spectrum. Everybody should want, and nobody more than families who need help, big help, wants more than the right matching of what people need in order to kind of produce a better outcome for their kids. I don't want to spend more than I have to, and also for families who don't need that much, they don't need the extra burden of having 5 appointments on their refrigerator door of all the things they're doing. But I also don't want to spend not enough for things where the brain science is telling me, you've got a window here, you could really change outcomes, and we're just piddling around. I don't want to do that. And the answer is not just more all the time, it's smarter. And this is where I think, this is for me the most exciting part of where the science is taking us, is if our hunch is right, our hypothesis, and actually the one thing I'd really want to say is I do not want anything I've said to be interpreted as I think I have all the answers, okay? I don't have all the answers. But we're trying really hard to think differently, and we're trying to use this science to just not keep doing the same stuff. And so it's leading us to say that there are core skills that some service systems and policy streams are investing in for parenting. And there's a whole other lot of money going into workforce development programs. And there's a whole lot of other money going into human services support systems, all of whom are busy trying to, do the best they can. And so our hypothesis is that there's a common core for all of them, which is those core capabilities that you need to be a successful adult. And there's a knowledge base and some strategies that we could begin to start to figure out, not that we have all the answers. But there is already a lot of money being spent not so smart.
And all these other areas.
And all these other
you
things.
Didn't mention childcare.
And childcare. And our answer to that is, less fragmentation, break down the silos, a more comprehensive, coordinated, integrated systems, right? There is no organization for the advancement of fragmented systems, right? And when people say...
You said that with just the right tone.
And everybody says we need better integration. But I think the problem is, or at least one new strategy, is it's not about interagency agreements. It's not about kind of aligning services. There is a common science core to all of them. And if we could have everyone be coming together, not about how to share information, but how to think together about how this common science core could introduce some new ways of each of them doing what they're doing around a common knowledge base. To me, that's worth digging into and trying, because the problem is each of these systems has a different knowledge base. They don't go to the same meetings. They don't train in the same programs. They don't, and I think this is the promise of 21st century science. A lot of people are going to make a lot of money from the biotechnology that's coming out of this science, right? It's revolutionizing medical care. It's revolutionized because it's helping us understand at a deeper level what causes disease and how we treat it. And at a deep level, it's like, how does the body work, right? And I said earlier, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not calling poverty a disease. But there's a common theme here of we have a deeper understanding and capacity of how adversity gets into the body and does bad things to your health, and does bad things. We've talked about the brain here, but at the same time, the inflammatory system that's activated is accelerating atherosclerosis. And the metabolic systems that are activated are accelerating insulin resistance and likely to get diabetes, all of which are also maldistributed based on adversity. So we haven't even talked about the possible returns of a healthier adult population, not just a better educated. And if you did a back of the envelope calculation with all of the returns on investment from more economic productivity and less crime, what if we decreased heart disease by 1% as a result of this?
There's a lot of people in this town who do those kind of calculations.
It's a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
And so heart disease, the NIH did a recent study to figure out how we could start thinking about preventing heart disease in childhood, not just getting 30-year-olds to start exercising and eat better. And there was a lot of focus on exercise and eating in kids, and also a suggestion that we start screening blood lipids down to age 8, and think maybe we should be even thinking about putting some 8-year-olds on statins who have elevated lipids. There's a lot of science now to say that if we can reduce the toxic stress in a lot of kids, that be another way to decrease heart disease later on, which comes decades later. So we just have to be more creative. This is what is great about our country, right? Ingenuity.
There's a lot of new knowledge and we're not using it.
Ingenuity, creativity, try things, failure the price of big breakthroughs. That's what drives every innovative part of our system. And in this world, we're saying we're not going to do anything unless it's already been proven. And if you do something that doesn't work, you're in danger of being shut down. That would have done quite a job on Silicon Valley. I would bet the first time that Apple developed any of its products, the first several prototypes were not successful.
So we're going to take questions. We have a particular Q&A here at AEI, which is that we ask that you actually ask a question. So when you have the microphone, about 15 seconds in, if we don't hear a question coming, we will give someone else a try. So who?
Catherine, there we go.
I'm Jean Gossman with Education Daily, and I'd like to ask Dr. Shonkoff, you spoke of not telling people, not giving people advice, but showing them what to do. So could you provide examples that contrast?
Yeah.
I mean, for example, I could give someone the advice of read more to your child. Should I show them what to read or how to engage with the child? That's the kind of thing I'm wondering.
Thanks for the question. I need to work on how I say what I'm trying to say. I never said don't give people advice. I just said that advice may not be enough for a lot of people. It's not, I mean, we love advice and giving information because we believe in education and it's inexpensive and it would be great. And it's not so much showing people what to do, it's a coaching model. I think, and this, it starts by coming from the science. So the science, what science we have about how you build these executive function skills. It's an interesting science because a lot of it comes from studies of college kids with ADHD who have problem focusing their attention and organizing themselves. Some of it comes from studies of adults who've had brain injuries in the prefrontal cortex, and it's a rehabilitation thing. And it's a smaller but growing knowledge base about how you build these skills, the ability to set goals and solve problems. You know, all these things that the multitasking kind of how do you deal with the challenges of life? And it's not so much to kind of show people what to do. It's to kind of build their capabilities or start with where they are and strengthen them in a coaching model, a mentoring model, a scaffolding model.
So earlier today I heard a presentation where someone described a program in San Francisco where they text message parents of children who are not yet ready for pre-K with sort of weekly
Right, yeah,
guidance.
I know those.
So I would say sound okay to you?
It sounds okay to me for people for whom getting a text message works.
Really helpful.
It's the modern version of giving people a cheat sheet or sitting down and it's the modern version of doing what was formerly on something you've Xeroxed, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not, I think there's this kind of tiered approach. I am for starting with basic stuff that will work and chip away at the population. I mean, and actually let's go back and start with everybody, right? So take people who have lots of education and don't worry about putting food on the table. So none of those people raise their kids by themselves. You know, they get medical care, they go to parent support groups if they want, they'll hire a psychologist or somebody to kind of help them figure out how to deal with their kids' problem. You know, not everybody, nobody raises kids entirely without support. Parents set up informal networks with each other. But then as you start moving up the pyramid and you get to people for whom those kinds of informal supports are not enough, then you need a little bit more professional advice. If you can pay for it yourself, you do it. If you can't, you get the best you can or somebody else provides it. And when you get to the top of the pyramid, which, it's the old 90-10 rule, right? I mean, that part of the population is the part that is just heading for the worst outcomes that are preventable, that are the most expensive outcomes. And also, many of these families don't even engage in the programs we have. This is not a matter of just supporting programs. A lot of the programs we have don't even touch the most disadvantaged, which means we need new ideas. So I'm all for just creating an environment that will allow us to figure out a better way of doing this, rather than just thinking it's worthless on the one hand, or we know exactly what to do, we just need more money. It's something in between.
There we go, right there.
Hi, and thank you so much. This is very interesting to me. My question, trying to figure out how to phrase it, but I'm wondering your point of view on how we create many of the environments that create the toxic stress. How do we control that? Just quickly, welfare, we created it, and it created huge toxic stress. Today, many of these families we speak about in terms of poverty being displaced in Washington, D.C. And you had said, when we look at some things 15, 20 years from now, we're going to wonder these decisions, a lot based on money. How can you possibly have any kind of an impact when we're talking about money and people becoming wealthy and the toxic stress that comes out of that for huge populations on reservations in cities and so forth?
Right, yeah. Well, I'm gonna do my best to answer that question, but I don't really have an answer to that. But let me tell you how we're approaching this. So sometimes a little bit glibly, but not so glibly, I would describe what we're doing as what to do while we're waiting for somebody to eliminate poverty and violence and maltreatment and substance abuse, right? Because I don't know how to do that. I mean, if somebody could do that, it's amazing how quickly things would get better. So the question is, in the presence of those, and discrimination, okay? And in the presence of those factors, for us, it's what can we do to increase the likelihood of breaking this intergenerational cycle disadvantage. So we go to the science, and the science is telling us the following things. This is not just about school readiness, it's also about the origins of lifelong health. This is not just about providing enrichment, this is also about figuring out how to protect the developing brain and other developing organ systems that are being affected adversely by excessive stress activation. And so as we start to think about, so what strategies could come out of that, we think that building the capabilities of the adults who are caring for kids to both buffer them from the stress and also model for them and help build their capacity to deal with stress, which is a fancy way of saying building resilience in children so that they will have a greater likelihood of overcoming the adversity by building resilience in the parents to give them the capability of dealing with adversity. Because for people who are dealing with serious stress, everything is on a time frame of today, right? It's dealing with the stresses of today, putting food on the table, having a roof over your head, dealing with a million things coming in at you, and not thinking about next month or next year. It's thinking about today. One of the first things that happens when people have some capability and space to kind of be able to make choices and plan and set goals is it's not just about making it to tomorrow, right? And so that then leads to, okay, so how do we do this? So at an individual level, I'm not thinking program yet. I'm just thinking like what has to happen. Because some of this could be provided by informal supports in an extended family or in a community. Some of it could be provided by voluntary organizations and faith-based organizations. It's not like you go to the government program first. But you keep going at some point. You either figure out how to provide those supports or you figure out what have we not thought about. And at the community level, which is I think part of what you were asking about, and this is where we're kind of looking for more people to work with us on this, rather than just say, well, strong communities are going to be important. We keep coming back to what's the theory of change. That's what the science is saying. Why do you think that this is going to produce that? So yes, strong communities, social capital, a sense of empowerment, is associated with better outcomes. But the scientist is saying, so how does that happen? How does that get into the body? And so for us, this has been, well, if we could reduce some of the precipitants of toxic stress in families, we could then provide a little bit more breathing room for families to be able to provide what their kids need. So then this is on a community basis. What are the major sources of toxic stress in the community? So you could think of reducing the level of violence in the community as something that is going to make it easier for parents to be able to kind of not have to deal with that, okay, or substance abuse or whatever. But I'm listening to myself talk and saying, well, so what are you saying, you know? It's kind of, it's like, but what I'm saying is we need to get more specific. We need to get more precise about what it is we're saying we should do, what our theory of change is, why we think that's going to make a difference, and then figure out how to do it and try it. And then measure whether, you know, measurement in this field has often been the enemy. People are trying to prove that we're not making a difference. No, measurement has got to be our most precious friend. If we're not making a difference, we want to know it so that we can figure out what to do differently, but it has to be an environment that allows you to learn. So that, I think that's the bottom line. We often have these meetings with people, and at the end, when we get to some of the things you've just raised, it's like I say, I don't know, but let's try to figure this out. As opposed to, I don't know, but how do we write a good proposal? Or I don't know, but how do we put the data together to stay in business? It should be how can we figure this out? And science is bringing some interesting ideas and insights into that discussion.
So we are just at 5 o'clock. I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank Jack very, very much for coming to. This has been wonderful for us, and thank Robert again for co-sponsoring.
Thanks. It's all fun.
Thank all of you for coming. We have wine and cheese outside, so we would love it if you would stay. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to ask your question, Jack will be here, and hopefully we can continue the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Did I do too much of the topic?
No, you were great.